Evolving and constructive and important. But there is a lot that can be done if countries engage. And so around the digital economy, perhaps around supply chains, around principles, around fairness. So there's potential there.
Yeah. So, Deputy Prime Minister Newton, how much should we think of ASEAN as a kind of coherent economic and political bloc? Because, you know, coming from Europe, there's a tendency maybe to mistake it for like something a bit like the EU, you know, which is a deeply integrated economic bloc and also has political aspirations, geopolitical aspirations. But ASEAN's very different. But can you have a like sort of something that's a kind of EU light, where you have a real free trade area, real dependence, work together as a bloc, or is that just...
Quindi ora sta chiedendo a lui di descrivere un po' in cosa consiste l'integrazione dell'Asia, che ovviamente è una struttura molto diversa da quella dell'Unione Europea.
Member states to mutually agree that we are no good without each other, without the other as well. I think if you look in geographic formation of ASEAN countries, we are the only region that connects West with East. Nobody could pierce through the Eastern Hemisphere without passing through ASEAN region. And 30 years back, we used our former Prime Minister, General Chai Soon-Hovan, when we had conflict with Cambodia. He once declared to change the battlefield to marketplace. I think we need to modify this philosophy, because there's no war in ASEAN, but we have competitions.
But you have a war next door, I mean a civil war in Myanmar. And
among countries we don't have.
Yeah, sure.
So if the major, especially the founding member states of ASEAN, we only compete in trade. We don't have any differences in politics, or we don't intervene with each other. So why don't we try to change the competition to become competence and make the whole region become competitive? We will therefore be able to blend ourselves with the other economies. But in ASEAN, say for example, in the past we used to try to dig a canal on the narrowest part of Thailand, but that would come with so many political interference. People talk about, even in our own country, people would talk about segregation, talking about divided the land, and talking about competitions. But nowadays, when trade is everywhere, Thailand is now is now planning to build rather than canal, because we think it's difficult to go through this political interference. So we call it land bridge.
Yeah.
We connect, one coast with another coast, but through inland logistics. So nobody could come to us and say, well, you're dividing the country, you're trying to segregate the minority and majority.
Io non ho capito di dove sta andando a parare Tommy, che qua il punto comunque che sottolineava appunto che l'ASEAN, i paesi dell'ASEAN non hanno conflitti di carattere politico tra di loro, vale il principio della non interferenza, hanno solo competizione economica, e quindi l'ASEAN è uno strumento per invece costruire un blocco regionale più coeso, in grado di aiutare tutte le singole economie a competere sul mercato globale. Mi sembra più o meno il ragionamento sia questo. Poi ho fatto tutto un ragionamento su un canale che non ci ho capito.
We no longer
non
competing
parava
each
da
other.
nessuna parte, non capivo solo.
We would save 4 days in transportation. And we could link the west to the east. And everyone becomes players. Thailand has no restriction in doing that. Talking about our
Singapore likes that.
next neighbor.
Yes.
Okay.
So
namely
can I just ask,
Myanmar.
because there is this perception that Thailand is probably the most
Again,
sympathetic to Myanmar,
that's why
the
I
current
say-
government. Yeah.
For the time being, with Myanmar, we have to help them. We have no more choice. All ASEAN members will have to help them. Or else, their people will be everywhere in our country. And we will have to I mean, by
But what does help
humanity,
mean,
we have to help them. But we have to help them, we have to, in whatever fashion we can. Like, for example, in Thailand, the basic thing that we would help them is during the pandemic, we donated all medical supplies, vaccines. We donate everyone along the borders.
Quindi questo è uno dei capitoli più interessanti, diciamo più accesi all'interno dell'ASEAN, perché appunto c'è la situazione del golpe militare, quindi anche di una guerra civile strisciante in Myanmar, che è diciamo un po' argomento tabù. Lui ora un pochino sta sostenendo la tesi aiutiamoli a casa loro perché sennò invadono il resto dei paesi dell'ASEAN, quindi diciamo l'ha messa più dal punto di vista delle politiche migratorie. Un Salvini che ce l'ha fatta.
Negotiating with everyone in the world without being, an underdog to other people.
Sure. Okay, but Minister, from the Indonesian perspective, again, the perception is that Indonesia is a little bit less patient with Myanmar and has talked about, maybe getting much tougher with them. Do you think that's the way to go, that you can't just say, well, we're going to help them because they're not really doing much?
Rahman is not necessarily, less patient to Myanmar, but if you look back to Indonesia 20, 30 years ago, I think military also controlled Indonesia, I should say.
Absolutely.
But then maturity among the leadership within the military also bring democracy.
Madonna, questi problemi qua di audio World Economic Forum c'hanno più 40 i polmoni, Dio cane, ora noi ce lo possiamo permettere.
We don't care whether you are military or civilian. Yeah. As long as you are qualified to manage something, they allow you to go there. My background military.
Yeah.
I retired from military. I spent 31 years in the military. But now I'm a civilian. I'm working under President Jokowi, which is civilian. So again, this maybe takes some time also for Myanmar to understand. And we try to share our experience to Myanmar to say, look, maybe you can also learn something from us. But we're not going to push them to do that because they have their own democracy. Each country has their own democracy. Let them exercise their own democracy. Let them exercise their own democracy, and we can support if they wish. And I think so far our foreign secretary has a quite good direct contact.
They're not very democratic at the moment. I mean, they're not very democratic at the moment. But do you think they're going to hold elections and transition back to?
Well, leave it to them. But we don't want to interfere too much their own domestic issue,
Capisci, comunque invece appunto vedevo passerò il mio tempo meglio che vomito e io invece li starei a sentire. Qui capito c'è proprio la distinzione tra questo principio della non interferenza che lui ha sottolineato subito. Questo si chiama Luhut Panjaitan e è il ministro del commercio indonesiano e ex militare, insomma, c'ha un curriculum abbastanza importante, visto che appunto l'Indonesia è stata a lungo una dittatura militare anche spietata, cioè nel senso, ricordiamo il metodo Jakarta, no? E appunto sta parlando di Myanmar dicendo noi non interferiamo e che per noi noi occidentali è proprio un principio che noi diciamo, come te sei più forte, non ti piace cosa succede, perché non ci vai con un esercito.
Military also can be part of the government. There are so many military also in charge of the government, but if they're not qualified, why should go to be a minister or to be the president? Let somebody else who are qualified to manage this country, like what happened in Indonesia. Yeah. My president doesn't have a military background, doesn't have a top PhD or something, but he has a very good management. He proved it now. If you look at Indonesia today, it's the best in our history, the last 77 years. Our economy, stability, and also downstream industry, digitalized. You mentioned about a digital economy. Because of COVID, Indonesia right now, nearly everything digitalized, ongoing now. So you can imagine government procurement of $105 billion, all digitalized this year. We can see the difference. So less and less corruption because of that, because you cannot do corrupt anymore, because you just go to the catalog. You don't need to do tender anymore. Even the military. So you can imagine the military right now procurement go to the catalog. Can you imagine that 10 years ago? No, Pak. Yeah. But today, Pak, it happened in Indonesia.
Yeah.
This is, I think, the process that we had to learn. So I believe also if this could happen to Indonesia, could happen also to anywhere in ASEAN members. So I'm pretty confident on that.
So you're sort of saying you can improve Myanmar and other places by example as much as by pressure?
Well, well, again, you know, our policy, we don't want to interfere too deep, too much to the other country domestic issue.
Sure.
Because you don't know exactly what's going on over there. Or other countries try to interfere in Indonesian problem. I say, hey, don't dictate Indonesia. We know what to solve the problem. If you look at the COVID, the very complex issue, you know, Indonesia is very successful to manage it. Nobody can blame us. Yesterday I met to AstraZeneca. I saw how do we set up the policy based on data, based on the technology. They said, I don't see any country better than Indonesia to tackle the COVID-19.
Okay, let me just ask one more question of Teresita and then we'll have a...
Veramente a me era molto interessante l'intervento di lui proprio con la perentorietà con cui proprio, cioè allora non ha capito cazzo, noi non interferiamo negli affari dei paesi altrui e se qualcuno interferisce negli affari indonesiani lo pigliamo a capocciate e dice una roba veramente molto interessante che cioè, solo le persone del paese hanno una conoscenza diretta e approfondita delle tematiche, quindi ogni interferenza è naturalmente, necessariamente guidata da interessi che non sono gli interessi di nessuna delle fazioni di quel paese lì.
The thing is we don't have a lot of foreign investment, so we look after ourselves and we were able to make some growth. So I think what we'll do is to emulate our members' country in the ASEAN, and it'll be okay.
But what are the particular strengths of the Philippines? I mean, you have, for example, kind of boomed in, you know, outsourcing. If you ring the Financial Times, for example, the phones are picked up in Manila. We have a big office there doing a lot of work for us. So where do you think the Philippines can grow in what?
I guess we are very low in digital. So I think the Americans are coming in, the American businesses are coming in on the digital side. And we can also look at Indonesia for some of the smaller digital.
Lei è Teresita Tanzikoson, è una imprenditrice, una manager delle Filippine, figlia di un noto, diciamo, di un oligarca filippino che è Henry Tan Chi Siang Si. Aspetta, sentiamo le domande.
And I guess the question that I have for the group, I think to your point, Deputy Prime Minister, one of the worries is that we lose a whole generation, right? Because there's a lot of young people in Myanmar today who feel like they don't have opportunities and are going elsewhere. And we will need those people when we rebuild. So I guess the question is, how can we continue to have growth and investment and development on the economic side of a country like Myanmar while we work through the political issues in parallel?
I think that was for you, yeah.
Well, as my friend from Indonesia mentioned, we can't interfere and involve in domestic political affair. But we try to help as much as we can. If we don't consider your country a partner or a neighbors, my country would never have more than 2 million workers from Myanmar. We don't call them refugees. We call them friends. We're using their workforce. We try to register them to make sure that they are not secondary to anyone. But there is so much we can do. So as I said, we need to use the strength of ASEAN to send a signal to that country that something must be modified or adapted to make sure that they will be able to go along with us and bring the whole region to stability and prosperity.
Okay. Yeah, gentleman over there. I think microphone.
Proviamo questa domanda, poi se comunque diciamo l'interpretazione principale di questo dibattito è appunto l'universalismo astratto degli occidentali versus la concretezza sovranista.
To two ministers with regard to your potential new membership to the ASEAN, Timor-Leste. In principle, last November, you've agreed to accept. And I think Indonesia is very eager to have a new membership. However, there are differences, I guess, in the acceptance level because, as we talked about today, different countries in the ASEAN region has different political position. Now, my question is, what are you going to deal with this issue? Because I think this year will be a key year for the accession.
Quindi qui sta parlando della richiesta di annessione da parte di Timor-Leste all'ASEAN e delle differenze all'interno dei paesi dell'ASEAN su questa procedura e quindi chiede come avete intenzione di gestire politicamente questa richiesta.
Timor-Leste has a long story, a long history with Indonesia. And I'm part of the history. If you're talking about Timor-Leste, I just had a meeting also this morning with President Ramos Horta, which is a very good friend of mine. Been friends since 1990, during even the conflict in Timor-Leste. I think we leave it to the member of G20 to schedule when they're going officially enter or join the ASEAN. So from Indonesian perspective, we don't have any problem with that. But then we should also listen to the other member of ASEAN about the membership of the Timor-Leste. I don't see from Indonesian perspective any problem with that.
Okay. John Chipman from the IISS in the front row here. John, could you stand, because they like to see you on camera.
A brief comment and a question. The brief comment is I've never heard any...
Visto che mi offendete perché non leggo la chat, la leggo un attimo, scusatemi, è che sono lì a seguir loro già, cioè non è che proprio il mio inglese sia così perfetto. No, appunto, vedo che ci sono sempre altri commenti su chi li ha nominati, questi eccetera. Questi sono membri del governo di paesi e quindi li hanno nominati, insomma, sovranamente i loro paesi. In Indonesia viga la Sharia? No, non credo. In Indonesia sono musulmani fondamentalisti. No, sono musulmani. Ci saranno anche fondamentalisti, ma sono musulmani. Non mi risulta assolutamente, insomma, un paese abbastanza laico. Cioè, cerchiamo di non creare già appena emerge una potenza che in qualche modo rivendica il suo diritto a esistere come Stato sovrano, cerchiamo di non appiccicargli subito un'etichetta a Occidente, insomma facciamoci un po' i cazzi nostri anche, visto che quando non ce li facciamo tendenzialmente facciamo solo danni, quindi insomma, eviterei di essere così precipitoso.
The Gulf countries are extremely interested in Southeast Asia, and again, your own sovereign wealth fund has got some
Qui è
assistance from the
Paperino che è
PIF in
intervenuto
Riyadh
direttamente.
and the Mubadala in the UAE. So I wonder whether the Southeast Asians here could say how much the South-South financial and economic flows as between the Gulf and ASEAN might move, and to what benefit to you.
Sure. Deputy Prime Minister, do you have an interest in the Middle East? Do you see money coming in from there?
Oh, definitely. With this pandemic, it has
Non ho seguito la domanda e più che altro volevo passare a quest'altro forum che è sull'India, visto che ce ne siamo occupati approfonditamente negli ultimi giorni, cerchiamo un po' di capire cosa si stanno dicendo.
There has been a consistent administrative performance of going to the doorstep of 800 million people, which has not happened in any part of the world. That shows not only tech prowess, but it shows the human potential of India. We have the potential, and Chandra is right, that one of the big transition strategies is based on skill. In India, is it only based on dissemination of skill to a segment of population? Or is it that tenacity, the audacity of the average Indian to repurpose their skill to address a challenge? Short story, in India, by February, when we were hit by the pandemic, India had only an import supply of 55,000 PPE suits. We did not have raw material, we did not have machinery, and we had 0 companies. March, when WHO had just pronounced the standards, industry got together with government and said, we do not have a single lab to test it. How do we work? Global supply chains had shut down, and PPE suits were at premium. People were literally fighting on every one shipment. What did India do? In 1 month, Indian industry and government turned around 11 labs in the country with high technology and serviced by the digital, I think, part of the industry capacity. 11 labs in 1 month. We did not dilute WHO standards, and we repurposed our manufacturing in the apparel sector. And suddenly, from 0 companies, in just 1.5 months, we went to 1,100 companies. And in 3 months, we became the 2nd largest exporters of PPE suits in the world, and at frugal costs. And that is why I say, why do I support what Chandra says about the India +1 story? We knew there is an economics to the pandemic, but we did not profit from it. We repurposed our skills, our manufacturing base, and we did things that nobody in decades thought possible. That is the India story.
Well, I think you...
Lei era Smriti Zubin Irani, che leggo essere ministro del donne e Women and Child Development, quindi sviluppo delle donne e dei bambini, e il primo ministro delle minoranze, degli affari relativi alle minoranze, non musulmano, che è uno un po' dei punti critici di questo governo Modi, nazionalista hindu.
Economy in the world. You're the largest democracy in the world, and of course you're chairing the G20 this year. And we heard earlier from Chandra at the CII Deloitte's breakfast that you've got your B20. What I think would be quite good to hear is, you've talked about exports, but what does India bring to the table? To quote you, Your Excellency Minister, earlier, what does India bring to the table on international business now that you are up there as having achieved economic strength? That's, I think, what I'd like very much to hear from the panel. Thank you.
Quindi chiede qual è il contributo che l'India può dare all'economia globale ora che ha raggiunto, diciamo, uno status di grande potenza, suggellato, diciamo, dall'ingresso nel G20 e dalla presidenza di turno del G20 quest'anno.
There was one approach where government was doing everything. I won't take any names. Government would like to control everything. Government would like to do everything in that particular geography. There is another approach where a few big tech, they monopolized everything. We in India in 2016 launched a totally new concept, which is public digital platforms, where the government invested in creating the platform and then anybody can join it. For example, the payment platform. More than 300 banks have joined it. More than 1.2 billion people are using it. Hundreds and hundreds of startups are using it. So that kind of concept, and it's all open source, to the point what can India offer to the international business. This is an open source, available to everybody. Already 13 countries have signed MOUs with us, and we'd be very happy to offer it to the world. And again, as
Lui è Ashwini Vaishnaw, è il ministro delle telecomunicazioni e dell'IT indiano e ha introdotto un tema che non conoscevo e che mi sembra molto interessante. Diciamo, diceva dal punto di vista dell'utilizzo della digitalizzazione della pubblica amministrazione, insomma tutto l'ecosistema digitale. Ci sono due sistemi, uno statalista, per cui c'è il controllo totale di ogni minimo iniziativa, che però non so quale sia il paese che ha un approccio statalista, non mi risulta ce ne sia nessuno, e poi altri che invece sono completamente ostaggi delle piattaforme private. Noi abbiamo fatto un'altra iniziativa di cui non sapevo niente, mi sembra molto interessante, che è quella di creare una piattaforma pubblica fatta con soldi pubblici, open source, che funziona da base per tutto l'ecosistema digitale. Non so esattamente in cosa consista questa piattaforma qua, magari mentre ascoltiamo un attimo provo a capirlo un attimo.
Technology to help give that support to mitigate climate change to nations which cannot afford that technology. Prime Minister Modi has opened up the space sector, but now we lead ISRO and its collaborative efforts with many countries who cannot afford that kind of a space program to specially combat climate change. Is that a humanitarian opportunity? Yes, but it's also an investment opportunity.
Chandra?
May I add?
Yes, please.
I think this one has to be seen slightly differently from my point of view. You said India is already up there. I think, yes, we are the fifth largest economy, but we are not there yet because we have a long way to go. We will have to address the per capita income to a different level from where we are now, and I can give you 100 other metrics. But having said that, what India brings to the table and can offer the world is, please look at the way India is solving its problem. Whether it's a vaccination problem or whether it is digitally connecting every citizen. By doing this, what we have done is, we have enabled the formalization of economy. What this is going to result in is almost 200 to 300 million additional people coming into the formal economy. People always ask if the technology is going to come in such a way, will it take over jobs? No, because technology is going to enable so many people come into the market and participate in the market, and that is going to drive phenomenal growth. So our solutions, you have to see India as building solutions to solve a problem. It is not technology, it is not one policy, it is a policy, technology, and other private sector participation, ecosystem development. That's how it has gone about it. Whether it is, I'm connecting the dots backwards. If you had asked me 3 years ago, 4 years ago, I couldn't have articulated it. And that India can offer. And it may be tech stacks. Originally, we created a simple horizontal stack, which was Aadhaar, unique identifier. Then we had the payment stack.
Yeah.
Allora, lui è Natarjan Chandrasekaran e è niente po' di meno che presidente di Tata Sons, che sostanzialmente è la holding di Tata Group, che è, diciamo, il conglomerato gigante che ha partecipazione, intanto è molto attivo è nell'automotive, è nei trasporti, telecomunicazioni, ICT, ma anche agroalimentare, tutto, sostanzialmente tutto, è veramente un conglomerato gigantesco. La cosa che sottolineerei di questo, dalle poche cose che abbiamo sentito di questo panel sull'India, è appunto abbastanza in linea con quello che raccontavamo nel video dedicato all'India, dove sostanzialmente l'India si pone come appunto sia a livello, lì parlavamo a livello anche geopolitico, no? Voice of the Global South, quindi diciamo raccogliere fare leva sul fatto che appunto della presidenza indiana del G20 per trasformarla in un'opportunità per avere una voce all'interno di quel consesso da parte del sud globale in qualche modo, quindi porsi come rappresentante e avamposto di tutto il sud globale, che non può più essere rappresentato, ma non semmai lo è stato, dalla Cina, perché la Cina diciamo ormai ha una potenza economica tale per cui molti paesi lo vedono come una minaccia. In effetti nei rapporti bilaterali tra Cina e altri paesi più deboli economicamente prevale ovviamente l'interesse cinese, quindi hanno tutti bisogno di trovare un controbilanciamento, no? Da questo punto di vista qua, e che tradizionalmente sarebbe stata da affidarsi mani e piedi agli Stati Uniti, ma appunto la fase è diversa. Gli Stati Uniti poi pretendono troppo, cioè diciamo non è che aiutano a costruire e a sviluppare la possibilità insomma di mantenere la propria sovranità, ma devastano la sovranità molto più di quanto non facciano i cinesi, nonostante siano i vicini più prossimi. Ma in questo caso appunto hanno fatto un paio di esempi, sia dal punto di vista della tecnologia, appunto il discorso che faceva prima, com'è che si chiama, il ministro delle telecomunicazioni Ashwini Vaishnaw, di questa piattaforma che appunto ha un ecosistema che pubblica all'interno della quale si possono sviluppare tutta una serie di servizi, e che per l'utilizzo della quale sono stati già firmati, mi sembra abbia detto una cosa come 15 memorandum of understanding, quindi per mettere a disposizione questa cosa qua a tutta una serie di paesi che non hanno le competenze, anche i capitali necessari per svilupparne una autonomamente. E facevano anche riferimento alle politiche spaziali. L'India ha come si dice, un piano spaziale, non so, detto male, credo così, piuttosto ambizioso. Nell'ultimo anno se ne è parlato abbastanza nei giornali principali internazionali, e però anche in questo caso dice, cioè noi vogliamo mettere a disposizione in qualche modo questa nostra posizione anche ai paesi che non possono sviluppare tutta la filiera in modo autonomo, per comunque allargare, diciamo, dare la possibilità anche ai paesi che possono solo focalizzarsi su alcune cose specifiche di partecipare insomma a questa nuova filiera che stiamo mettendo in campo, più o meno. Io lo interpreterei così.
More on healthcare, she spends more in education, and she fuels those aspects of the economy which Chandra is very gung-ho about. But if you make sure that that transition happens from the SME segment to not only big corporation but even mid-size, that is the revolution India is waiting for.
Absolutely. That is clearly one of the very important revolutions that we must ensure is unleashed, because to truly unlock the power of the economy, we need to unlock the power of India's women as well. Minister Vaishnav, Minister Irani, and Chandrasekharan, many, many thanks for joining us here to give us your insights on what the India story looks like, and more importantly, where the India story is headed. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us here this afternoon. Appreciate your time.
Allora, vediamo un attimo se c'è ancora l'unico panel dove c'era... No, è finito, va bene, sono finiti i panel perché era 10, 15, 11, e quindi la prossima session di panel, fammi vedere se c'è qualcosa, che poi mi viene subito la voglia di riattaccare la diretta immediatamente, oppure ciao. Quindi ora sono le 11, questa è la lista dei panel, aspetta, la rimpicciolisco, non si vede una sega. Eccoli qua. Ora c'è Guterres da una parte, fra pochino 11:15, 11:30, The Economy of Super Aging Society, quindi il problema dell'invecchiamento della popolazione e appunto tutto come si affronta dal punto di vista economico. Don't let greenwashing fears stall credible action, quindi diciamo una critica al greenwashing e soprattutto diciamo, non lasciamo che il greenwashing, la paura del greenwashing crei uno stallo invece anche per le azioni più credibili. Real estate at a turning point. Intanto notavo la cosa interessante è che non c'è mai un italiano in nessuno di questi e sinceramente a parte il special address by Antonio Guterres dove c'è anche Klaus Schwab che è il fondatore e il presidente di World Economic Forum, sinceramente non vedo nomi che conosco. Unlocking investment non-aid for frontier market, quindi appunto lo spostamento del focus dagli aiuti a invece gli investimenti. Twinning energy with digital, ok, quindi digitalizzazione del mercato energetico. In the face of fragility, central bank digital currencies, tutta la partita delle monete digitali. Moving towards nutrition security, quindi sicurezza alimentare. How to prevent lost learning, quindi non so se si possa dire abbandono scolastico o comunque diciamo la perdita delle opportunità dal punto di vista formativo. Il primo inizia alle 11:15. In effetti Guterres sarebbe da sentire, questo credo potrebbe essere anche interessante, ma credo sia un po' troppo specifico, e quindi sì, potremmo aspettare un altro pochino. Io qui va a finire che non mi metto a lavorare e quindi non faccio il video per domani, cosa che Ottolina tendenzialmente non si può granché permettere. La registrazione dei panel non c'è, no? Perché sennò questo è quello che ha finito ora, che vi volevo far vedere, è questo fiscal expansion, a welcome return or ticking bomb, quindi diciamo il ritorno dell'espansionismo fiscale, quindi la spesa pubblica sostanzialmente. Un ben voluto ritorno o una bomba a orologeria, e c'era anche Paolo Gentiloni in questo panel qua. Mi sarebbe stato forse interessante stare a sentire. Intanto sto parlando a vanvera per temporeggiare perché volevo aspettare appunto questo. Questa è la pagina del programma, no? E quindi qui c'è una cosa che non so, governo del Marocco. Vabbè. Però c'è Klaus Schwab.
I think you were the very first African and Arab world team to qualify for the World Cup semi-finals. What do you think that means for Morocco? First of all, it is true that we were ourselves surprised. Morocco has always had a great football team. It's not by chance. There's been a lot of investment, a lot of supervision, followed very closely by our sovereign. We have training schools which we have professionalized nationally, notably.
In chat qualcuno appunto ci ricorda di questo evento qua, della morte, dello schianto dell'elicottero che trasportava il ministro dell'interno ucraino, sul quale però appunto non ho niente di particolare da dire perché non stavo, ho giusto intravisto, qualcuno aveva mandato in chat la notizia. È precipitato un elicottero presso Brovary nella regione Kiev, si teme una strage perché nella zona c'è un asilo e si segnalano morti ignoti al momento le cause e l'esatta dinamica dell'incidente non si capisce, però se è lo stesso incidente. Stavo cercando di capire se qualcuno ha scritto qualcosa su questa roba qua, ma no, niente, quindi sentiamo il primo ministro.
Of engagement, of solidarity, but also values of the relationship that we have with our mothers, with our wives, and it really showed how important women are in our society. There was not a single game that ended with the
Questo è
players
tradotto in 1000 lingue.
going
Quello volete
to
sentire,
embrace their
sentiremo la
mothers or their
lingua
wives to share.
À travers cette Coupe du Monde, c'est que vraiment un élan de sympathie pour cette équipe nationale du Maroc. Je profite de l'occasion pour vous remercier.
Non, Monsieur le Président, on vous souhaite, je crois, en résumé de notre discussion, je crois au nom des participants, je vous souhaite beaucoup de victoires similaires, pas seulement dans le football, mais dans votre transition énergique et naturellement dans votre programme d'éducation que vous avez mentionné et surtout aussi dans votre industrialisation. Alors un grand merci d'être venu à Davos et on vous souhaite tout le bien.
Merci.
Ah no, subito dopo c'è appunto Special Address by Antonio Guterres, quindi diciamo ora arrivano, stavo cercando, guardiamo un attimo se c'è qualcosa su l'incidente, vediamo un po' New York Times.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated for the upcoming session.
For the upcoming session, crash in Ukraine, kills. Ok, quindi incidente di elicottero, morte appena come minimo 18 persone, incluso il ministro degli interni. Eccolo qua là. Here's what we know, cosa sappiamo? Non sappiamo ancora cosa ha causato l'incidente dell'elicottero vicino a un asilo, ma non ci sono insomma evidenze che sia stato abbattuto. Zelensky will address the Davos gathering in a marathon week of diplomacy. Quindi c'è poi Zelensky a Davos perché non risultava. Ieri c'è stata la moglie, la Zelenska. Ukraine Minister for Internal Affairs at the least 3 children killed in helicopter crash near Kiev. Vediamo un po' se c'è qualcosa. Because of the crash, which the state emergency service was not immediately clear. The pain is unspeakable. Ukraine Parliament saying a state of those killed include Denis Monastirsky, che è il ministro appunto degli affari dell'interno. Niente, allora invece guardiamo questa cosa qua, quando c'è Zelensky, a parte che Zelensky ha rotto coglione ovunque. No, ma lei non ho capito. Mercoledì, oggi è previsto Zelensky, ma è un fuori programma. Perché non c'era nel programma ufficiale, infatti mi ero anche chiesto perché era un po' strano, insomma, no, abbastanza insomma, è giustificato per carità, però è abbastanza presenzialista, mi sembrava un'assise dove non potesse in qualche modo mancare. Vediamo un attimo se nel frattempo sono arrivati, eccoli. Spilungone.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it's a special honor and privilege to welcome back to Davos His Excellency Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations. The UN has never been as important as it is today in a fractured and fragmented world. We are all grateful, Mr. Secretary General, that despite all those fractions and difficulties, you stand up for global cooperation, and that you also have the courage to speak out and to remind all of us of the difficulties. You stand up for global cooperation, and that you also have the courage to speak out and to remind all of us of the danger and of the possible catastrophic consequences if we don't get our act together. You can count on us, Mr. Secretary General, to support you in your efforts by engaging all stakeholders into collaborative action to ensure, despite the headwinds, that we achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. At the beginning of this year, we are grateful that you share with us again your assessment of the state of the world. This will be followed by a conversation with my colleague, Børge Brende. Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, please, we welcome you very cordially.
Non ho capito sta scelta di affiancare Børge Brende, che è un politico norvegese conservatore, non esattamente un manifesto alla collaborazione, alla de-escalation globale.
Dear President Schwab, for your kind words. It is very good to be back in Davos and once again in person. Your team perfectly sets out the dilemma of today's world. We need cooperation, yet we face fragmentation. And I'm not here to sugarcoat the scale of that challenge or the sorry state of our world. We can't confront problems unless we look them squarely in the eye. And we are looking into the eye of a Category 5 hurricane. Our world is plagued by a perfect storm on a number of fronts. Start with the short term, a global economic crisis. The outlook, as we all know, is bleak. Many parts of the world face recession, and the entire world faces a slowdown. And we see deepening inequalities and the rapidly unfolding cost of living crisis affecting women and girls the most. Supply chain disruptions and an energy crunch, soaring prices, rising interest rates along with inflation, and debt levels pounding vulnerable countries. Add to all of that the lingering effects of the pandemic. COVID-19 is still straining economies with the world's failure to prepare for future pandemics. That failure is straining our credulity. Somehow, after all we have endured, we have not learned the global public health lessons of the pandemic. We are nowhere near ready for the pandemics to come. And to all that, another major and indeed existential challenge. We are flirting with climate disaster. Every week brings a new climate horror story. Greenhouse gas emissions are at record levels and growing. The commitment to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees is nearly going up in smoke. Without further action, we are headed to a 2.8 degree increase, and the consequences, as we all know, would be devastating. Several parts of our planet would be uninhabitable, and for many, it will mean a death sentence. But this is not a surprise. The science has been clear for decades. And I'm not talking only about UN scientists. I'm talking even about fossil fuel scientists. We learned last week that certain fossil fuel producers were fully aware in the 70s that their core product was making our planet. And just like the tobacco industry, they rode roughshod over their own science. Some, in big oil, peddled the big lie. And like the tobacco industry, those responsible must be held to account. Today, fossil fuel producers and their enablers are still racing to expand production, knowing full well that this business model is inconsistent with human survival. Now, this insanity belongs in science fiction, Yet we know the ecosystem meltdown is cold, hard, scientific fact. Add to this toxic brew yet another combustible factor: conflict, violence, war. Especially the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Not only because of the untold suffering of the Ukrainian people, but because of its profound global implications on global food and energy prices, on trade and supply chains, on questions of nuclear safety, and on the very foundations of international law and the United Nations Charter. We are doing our best, making progress where we can, particularly in facilitating exports of food and fertilizers from Ukraine and also from Russia. But we are a far cry from peace in line with international law and the United Nations Charter. So, dear friends, all these challenges are interlinked, and they are piling up like cars in a chain reaction crash. Now, let's be clear. It would be difficult to find solutions to these global interlinked problems in the best of times and in a world that would be united. But these are far from being the best of times, and the world is far from being united. Instead, we face the gravest levels of geopolitical division and mistrust in generations, and it is undermining everything. First, the East-West divide. We risk what I've called a great fracture, the decoupling of the world's two largest economies. A tectonic rift that would create two different sets of trade rules, two dominant currencies, two internets, and two conflicting strategies on artificial intelligence. This is the last thing we need. The IMF reported that dividing the global economy into two blocks could cut global GDP by a whopping $1.4 trillion US. Now, there are many aspects in which the US and China relations will inevitably diverge, particularly on questions of human rights and on some areas of regional security. But despite that, it is possible, and I would say it is essential, for the two countries to have meaningful engagement on climate, trade and technology to avoid the decoupling of economies, of even the possibility of future confrontations. For the historians that might be listening, we must avoid a 21st century sequel of the so-called Thucydides trap. At the same time, and secondly, the North-South divide is deepening. I am not convinced, in my contacts, that the wealthier world and their leaders truly grasps the degree of frustration and even anger in the global South. Frustration and anger about the gross inequity of vaccine distribution in the recent past. Frustration and anger about the pandemic recovery, with support overwhelmingly concentrated in wealthier countries that could print money. And trillions were printed in the global north, and of course, developing countries could not print money because their currencies would go out the drain. Frustration and anger about a climate crisis that is crippling countries that contributed least to global heating, and the lack of the financial resources to respond to the challenge. And frustration and anger over a morally bankrupt financial system in which systemic inequalities are amplifying societal inequalities. A system that is still routinely denying debt relief and concessional funding to vulnerable middle-income countries that are in desperate need, because the rules are not made to allow it. A system in which most of the world's poorest countries saw their debt service payments skyrocketed by 35% in the last year alone. Now, we need to bridge all these divides, and we need to restore trust. How can we do it? First, by reforming and building fairness into the global financial system. Developing countries need access to finance to reduce poverty and hunger and advance the Sustainable Development Goals. I have urged the G20 to agree on a global SDG stimulus plan that would provide support to countries of the Global South, including the vulnerable middle-income ones. They need the necessary liquidity, debt relief and restructuring, as well as long-term lending to invest in sustainable development. In short, we need a new debt architecture. And multilateral development banks must change their business model. Beyond their own operations, that of course are very important, they must concentrating on multiplying their impact, leveraging massively private finance in a systematic way, providing guarantees, accepting to be first risk takers in coalitions of financial institutions to support developing countries. Without creating the conditions for massive inflow of private finance at reasonable cost to the developing world, there is simply no solution. International financial institutions are too small, and the capacity to increase ODA is not to be seen in the short term. Then second, bridging divides and restoring trust means meaningful climate action, and climate action now. The battle to keep the 1.5-degree limit alive will be won or lost in these decades, on our watch. And right now, we have to confess that the battle is being lost. So we need to act together to close the emissions gap. And that means to phase out progressively coal and supercharge the renewable revolution, to end the addiction to fossil fuels, and to stop our self-defeating war on nature. On the other hand, the developed world must finally deliver on its 100 billion climate finance commitment to support developing countries. Adaptation finance must be doubled, as it was promised in Sharm el-Sheikh. And the biggest emitters, namely the G20 countries, must unite around the Climate Solidarity Pact, in which they make extra efforts in the 2020s to keep the 1.5-degree limit alive. And it doesn't work if developed countries attribute responsibility to emerging economies and emerging economies attribute responsibility to developed countries. They need to come together, to bring together all their capacities, financial and technological, with the developed ones providing financial and technical assistance to help the major emerging economies to accelerate their renewable energy transition. Because if they don't, we will not be able to reduce emissions at the level that is necessary to keep the 1.5-degree goal, I would say to keep the 2-degree goal alive. And our climate goals need the full engagement of the private sector. Now, the truth is that more and more businesses are making net zero commitments, but benchmarks and criteria are often dubious or murky. And this can mislead consumers, investors, and regulators with false narratives. And it feeds a culture of climate misinformation and confusion, and leaves the door open to greenwashing. That's why we created an expert group on net zero emissions commitments. Recently, the group has issued a how-to guide for credible, accountable net zero pledges. And here at Davos, I call on all corporate leaders to act based on these guidelines, to put forward credible and transparent transition plans on how to achieve net zero, and to submit those plans before the end of the year. Now, the transition to net zero must be grounded in real emissions cuts and not relying essentially on carbon credits or shadow markets. And finally, what is true about private sector engagement on climate applies across a range of challenges. And government action is critical, even if obviously it is not enough. We must find avenues to boost the private sector's ability to play its full role for good. And it must be recognized that in many ways, the private sector today is leading, but it is to a certain extent undermined by government action or the lack of government action. Governments need to create the adequate regulatory and stimulus environments to support the private sector, instead of maintaining rules, subsidies, and other forms of action that undermine the efforts of the private sector to move forward in climate action. And business models and practices must be reworked to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. without creating the conditions for the massive engagement of the private sector, it will be impossible to move from the billions to trillions that is needed to achieve the SDGs. To lead the way, to expand economic opportunity for women, to ensure greater engagement and cooperation for vaccine equity, to achieve global food security, and for that, we need the cooperation of the private sector to keep Ukrainian and Russian food and fertilizer exports flowing and affordable. Even in the midst of the war, the insurance sector has helped support the movement of vessels from Ukraine and Russia. And we urgently need other private sector actors to engage, such as the banking sector, the traders, and the shippers. Across the spectrum of global challenges, we need private sector resourcefulness and cooperation to be able to advance in our common objectives of peace, of sustainable development, and of human rights. So, Excellencies and dear friends, there are no perfect solutions in a perfect storm, but we can work to control the damage and to seize the opportunities available. And now more than ever, it's time to forge the pathways to cooperation in our fragmented world, to adopt multilateral solutions, to bring trust to where trust is badly needed because the world cannot wait. And I thank you for your patience.
Volevo molto appunto sottolineare molto questo ruolo qua dei privati, non so se è la cosa su cui avrei posto l'accento, comunque io massimo rispetto per Antonina, ho visto tanti il killer numero uno eccetera, sì, proprio lui il killer numero uno, lui il Papa e il Romano Prodi. E allora, Twinning Energy, vediamo un po' che cosa c'era qua. Twinning Energy with Digital, non me ne frega un cazzo. Unlocking investment, not aid frontier market. In the face of fragility, central bank, digital currency, super aging society, ma va a nutrition security, no, vabbè, mi sembra che si possa anche fare festa. Andiamo un attimo a vedere chi cazzo.
Samaila Zubairu is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Africa Finance Corporation. It's one of the world's largest development finance institutes. It's based in Nigeria, serves Africa, 37 member countries. Peter Maurer is a regular at these kinds of sessions at Davos. He has been leading this agenda for years now. You probably remember him as the leader of the ICRC. He is now the President of the Board of the Basel Institute on Governance. Nice to see you, Peter. Next to him is Vera Songwe, who's the chair of the board of the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility, and Vera was until recently leading the UN.
Due palle. Mark Hatley chiede in sintesi cosa sta uscendo da questo forum, domandone, no, non siamo in grado di fare una sintesi di quello che sta uscendo da questo forum, l'unica cosa diciamo appunto dei due panel precedenti, vabbè, il titolo del forum è collaborazione in un mondo frammentato, quello che prima abbiamo visto due panel, uno che parlava appunto dedicato all'India e l'altro dedicato all'ASEAN e appunto diciamo semplicemente vengano confermate, e anche è stata una parte importante dell'intervento di Guterres quando appunto ha parlato del fatto che l'Occidente non capisce il livello di frustrazione che i paesi del sud globale provano insomma in questa fase, anche dopo la crisi pandemica e tutto, comunque di sempre maggiore allargamento del gap e in completa incapacità di affrontare problemi sistemici, a partire da quello su cui appunto ha posto particolarmente l'accento, probabilmente giustamente, Guterres, che è quello del cambiamento climatico, della crisi ambientale, e quindi diciamo emerge appunto la postura delle forze dei paesi emergenti che in nessun modo hanno intenzione di arretrare rispetto a una richiesta di loro maggiore partecipazione e protagonismo nel palcoscenico globale. Quindi sostanzialmente dicono un mondo frammentato, principalmente il trend principale sì, un mondo frammentato, ma è principalmente un mondo che ormai non accetta più l'egemonia degli Stati Uniti, e questo è un po' il discorso. Guterres stesso ha fatto accenno ad alcune delle partite principali di questo processo, diciamo, globale di decolonizzazione, che sono appunto il sistema finanziario globale, dove lui appunto in particolare ha messo in maniera sottile, non aggressiva, sotto accusa appunto un sistema basato sulla dittatura del dollaro, quando ha fatto chiaramente riferimento ai paesi che possono cavarsela stampando moneta, mentre i paesi del sud globale moneta non la possono stampare perché significa un deprezzamento immediato del valore della loro valuta, che significa inflazione alle stelle, visto che dipendono molto fortemente da importazioni di prodotti finiti di ogni genere che vengano appunto acquistati in dollari. Niente, questo è un po', diciamo, probabilmente mi sono perso 85 volte, però vabbè, senti, niente, siccome qui in ballo c'è il fatto che riesca a fare i contenuti per domani, direi che questi panel non sono così attraenti, quindi semmai ci ritorniamo in giornata con un'improvvisata live reaction ad un'altra sessione di panel. Vi saluto per ora, grazie di avermi sopportato un altro po', ci vediamo più tardi probabilmente. Buona giornata, a dopo.